Hello, and welcome to today's 18 Group webinar on adding value and improving efficiencies in sanctions screening. My name's Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at 18 Group, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Shabir Hussain, Director, Financial Crimes at Compliance at a Silicon Valley Bank, and Jan Ulrich, Vice President of Research and Education at Manta, Igor Simkovsky, Senior Manager, Financial Crime Advisory at Santander, and Oliver Bodmer, Senior Product Manager at Six. I'll ask them all to introduce themselves individually in a moment, but first a little bit of info to help you make best use of the webinar. To the right of your screen, you'll see a panel which says Q&A and polls. We'll be running 3 polls today, so that's your opportunity to vote in the polls. They will come up as I announce them, so please do vote. Let us know your thoughts on the topics we are talking about. And in the Q&A panel, please post any questions you have for our speakers. Please post them as we go along, because we'll take the questions during the Q&A rather than trying to address them at the end, when no doubt we will run out of time. So put your questions there when you're ready, and do take part in the polls. Enough of me then. Over to our speakers. Shabir, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your interest in sanctions.
Sure. Shabir Hussain. I lead business oversight of our sanction screening systems and innovation for these systems globally for Silicon Valley Bank. As part of my role, I do drive reduction of false positives by use of machine learning techniques and other rules-based techniques towards alert reduction. Also, we are responsible for running a variety of controls as part of our sanction systems governance framework on our sanction screening systems.
Thank you. Yeah, over to you.
Jan Ulrich, thank you. So I'm responsible for research and education here at Manta. Manta as a company deals with an automated solution for data lineage, basically bringing the visibility into your data pipelines and transparency into the environment. And when it comes to sanctions, or in more general anti-money laundering or FCC compliance, we see a lot of challenges that are related to data management and visibility into the pipeline. So it's of a big interest for us, for sure.
Okay, thank you. And moving over to you, Igor.
Hi, everyone. Igor Simkovsky, Santander, UK. I'm senior manager for sanctions policy and complex advisory, which means upkeeping the sanctions policy and the standards for Santander, ensuring that what we have within the sanctions framework is actually included in the policy and it is implemented by the bank. And opinions today will be my own and not the views of my employer. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that. And over to you, Oliver.
Yeah, hi, my name is Oliver Bodmer. I'm connecting here from Switzerland. I'm working for Six. Six is the Swiss infrastructure exchange. So we're running the Swiss and the Spanish stock exchange. We have a custody business and also a financial information business. And I'm the responsible product manager for all our offering around sanctions screening and KYC and AML. And happy to be on this webinar here.
Thank you all. Let's start our conversation actually with an audience poll question. The question is, how challenging is global sanctions compliance at your organization? As I said earlier, you'll see that poll on your screen to the right of the video. So whilst you answer that one, I don't think it's going to be very difficult for you. Let me come to Igor, if I may, to talk about how sanctions have developed and to what extent in financial markets over the past few years.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, good. I guess a good question to begin with. The sanctions itself, financial sanctions, interesting enough, it is not a new concept. It's been applied in ancient Greece even. But when we are talking about modern sanctions, I think the milestones are probably 20th century. We've seen the country-oriented sanctions regimes. So certain countries are prohibited, and pretty much all trades between two countries, the one imposing the sanctions and the one which is under sanctions, are prohibited. So that was probably a fairly simple concept from perspective of sanctions compliance officer. So you know what you have on your plate, you deal with that everything is prohibited, straightforward. Then there was a shift towards more targeted model. So what is called the smart sanctions. Probably we've seen this starting in the last decades of the last century. So we have certain individuals and entities, in addition to the countries being listed, again, from sanctions compliance perspective, not still challenging, but doable, managing the lists, data, and just having your screening system calibrated properly. But then the shift when we see, in particular, the Russia sanctions now, but even 2014, the sectoral sanctions, that was a significant shift. So moving from country and targeted sanctions towards sectoral sanctions, and prohibiting certain financial instruments, prohibiting certain sectors. And this is where the challenges are for a financial institution. I think there is a view that the sanctions landscape will become even more complex going forward. The view is that financial sanctions are used as a good alternative for a war. So with the governments being more reluctant to send troops on the ground, it is very likely that the sanctions regimes will evolve in a way that they will be used even more. So in conclusion, I think the latest Russia set of sanctions, US, UK, and EU, it is a good illustration about the complexity that the financial institutions are facing. That's one thing, the complexity. And the second thing, the rapid response, which is expected by the regulator. So that's probably even a bigger challenge these days.
Okay, thank you. Jan, what would you like to add to that? How have you seen things developing?
I couldn't agree more with Igor. Definitely in the last few years, we've seen a huge growth of the number of use of sanctions, as well as the how well targeted they are to focus on particular individuals, particular sectors. And if you actually look at the sanctions lists in the world, there are realistically thousands of them. They are issued by individual countries, by particular institutions, by UN and others. And that's one thing. The second thing is definitely the rate of change. It's not just the reaction time or response time to the sanctions, but even how often these sanctions change, how often the new ones are introduced. They can change on a daily basis, which is really crazy. And it makes it much harder to actually react to them fast. And basically, you have to build some infrastructure to be able to support them reasonably. And as Igor said, it's very likely that we'll see more of them coming. And they will very likely become more and more targeted, which actually puts much higher requirements on our infrastructure to be able to support them. And so that's one thing. Second thing that I would actually add is the complexity of the sanctions. Following a particular list of individuals, list of companies, list of countries, that's fairly simple, fairly manageable. But these kind of secondary sanctions that are targeting either third parties or usage of shell companies, these kind of things will make it much more complex and hard to actually implement.
Okay.
So one thing. Another one that I believe is very challenging for lots of organizations is that the rules are often somewhat unclear. What does the ownership means and so on. But the penalties can be heavy, and it can be penalties by the government or some ruling agencies, or just the reputation damage. Right? We've seen quite recently that there are like top 20 companies who have not left Russia, for example. So definitely this reputation damage is something that can be even more devastating than the penalties by regulators.
Okay, thank you. Please maybe see the poll results now. And Jan, if you'd like to comment on this and see how people are getting on with it. Quite challenging, a little challenging. Only 22% of our audience saying very challenging. What do you think? What do you say to that?
It's quite surprising for me, but pleasantly surprising that we do not see the very challenging as being the biggest category here. So it would be really interesting to hear more about what our people focused on, which we'll probably see in a moment.
Okay, that's excellent indeed. Let's run a second poll. And once again, to our audience, you can see that to the right of your video. And this one asks, what are the challenges of sanctions screening at your organization? This time you can tick as many of the boxes as are appropriate. And while you do that, let me come back to Jan to identify how he sees the challenges that these large and constantly changing numbers of sanctions raise for capital markets participants.
Yeah, so I believe that I quite touched it at the first question. Definitely, the sanctions are being spelled more often than previously. We hear much more about them, and the main challenge that I see is definitely the pace of change, the time to response, and that's I would say the key challenge here. The second one is definitely the granularity, company, country, person through the shell companies or third parties, the secondary type of sanctions. And third, it is, I'm not sure if others would agree with it or not. we shall see. I would say that a lot of the challenges related to sanctions has to actually do with our internal data management and basically the ability to quickly understand whether we are screening the right data, whether we have a complete and consistent set of data that we screen against, and basically how fast we can identify the elements that we need to add if there's a new sanction or a new type of structure of those sanctions that may require additional piece of data that we had not considered previously. So that would be my take on it.
Okay, coming to you, Igor, as a practitioner, where do you feel the hard bits? Where are the challenges?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Jan already touched on that. So yeah, the rapid change, it is something that is a significant challenge for the FIs, and the expectations from the regulator for the FI to be on front foot. So the sanctions are introduced this afternoon, for example, you're expected to be compliant for that very moment. So each transactions from the following, then you're expected to have screened and you have complied with. But the complexity, which I mentioned before, it is probably one of the key challenges. So I would say broadly, you can probably say that you have two sets of data that you deal with when you screen the external data. So the first set is probably what is explicit. So you have list of entities, individuals, financial instruments, and so on, which are listed. You feed that in your screening system. And that's probably, it is the easier part. What is more challenging is the implicit sanctions. So Jan mentioned about the ownership. So even, let's say you have an entity which is owned more than 50%, or if there is a control of a person subject to sanctions, you're expected not to allow any transactions related to this entity. And this entity is not listed in the first list that I mentioned, the implicit one. But the FI is still expected to carry out KYC and satisfy themselves that they are not dealing with a person subject to sanctions. Complexity about the rules. So talking about the ownership, US rule, for example, just for illustration, is aggregation is straightforward. You have person A, B, and C being beneficial owners of the entity. If they own more than 50%, then that entity is subject to sanctions. So what you can do, even if it is not on the external list, you can list that on your internal list, and then you're fine. The problem is in the UK, it is a different interpretation. It is just one of the A, B, and or C owning more than 50%. Then you have ownership proven. EU, even more complicated. The guidance recently provided was talking about aggregation, but equally it allowed each country to have their own interpretation. And if you are a bank, which you have this nexus, for example, you are a UK bank, but you are headquartered by an EU parent, then you need to comply with both. And because of the hefty fines from US, you need to comply with US as well. So most of the UK banks, even though they're technically not US persons, in their policy and the risk appetite will have this compliance with the US sanctions set as a standard. So I think that's the complication is rapid change, not always the level of clarity that we would expect, and the severe consequences if things go wrong. So these are probably the three key.
Okay,
items.
we'll come back to penalties later on, but let's stick on this nice positive note where we're at. And Oliver, what do you see when you're out there in the market in terms of what your customers are saying is the hardest parts of sanction screening?
Yeah, so I can mainly say, since what we have been doing, so we have been active in these in these sanctions that are linked to securities, and this has been a challenge for the clients mainly. So 2014 Russia sectoral sanctions was rather straightforward, right? Some named entities, and then the investment into new debt was prohibited, right? You mainly had to. Of course, and you needed to have this financial instrument data, and you needed to get it right? So then mainly you could look at issuing dates of these securities, and you could say, everything that had been issued prior to that date, you could still trade. But what we have seen is also, the regulation wanted to prohibit, new money flowing into these banks. So they would not do new issuances, but they might be doing capital increases on all the instruments, right? So you needed to have this data ready just to be able to identify these, we call these corporate actions, capital increases on these instruments. And then what we have seen also with this 50% rule, and then more and more becoming a data game, right? Under the Trump administration, this CATSA list with all these oligarchs, and then only a couple of them made it on the SDN list. But what we have seen, I think they were linked into 6,000 entities, right? So when then the US is designating something on a Friday afternoon, and this is with an immediate effect, and they're nice, right? They're doing this on a Friday midday US time, when in Europe, the people are already finished with work, and so you get your systems right until Monday morning. And I think this is why data is so important, because you can't start analyzing these ownership trees of these oligarchs over the weekend. So this is something that you need to have done prior to that you somehow can tick the boxes. Another point was also when these Chinese sanctions came, XPCC and then CMICs, there are some clients, especially here in Western Europe, I don't know how it was in the US, especially, language, right? Matching Chinese characters is not so easy like matching English or German or any other language. So, and then lastly, I would also say now what we've seen with Ukraine was really unprecedented. The pace of these new sanctions being issued, right? There we really had to stay up on the game, just each week there was something new coming. And if you have some key stakeholders that are out on vacation there, I think these were challenges really. So, and we thought after China it would be calmer, but now Ukraine is here, and it has been as hectic as never before.
Okay, as you say, everybody has got to be on top form and ready to act. So let's see what our audience thinks. Maybe see the poll results, please. Sourcing necessary entity data, keeping up with imposed and lifted sanctions, false positives. Igor, would you like to comment on these results?
Yeah, it is a good mixture. Yeah, I think I agree. Probably false positives are expected to be higher, but I think equally makes sense. Sourcing necessary entity data, 58%. It depends on where if you rely on a third party or you have in-house solution. So probably that's a different question. And we have mentioned about keeping with imposed and lifted sanctions. The changes are too frequent and very rapid. And false positives, no surprises there. And I think we'll touch on that later in this webinar.
Indeed, we will. And I'm going to come straight back to you, Igor, actually, to dive a little bit deeper into this and talk a little bit more about how firms can reduce false positives to improve the process of identifying sanctioned people, entities, and sort of jurisdictions. How can you work on that?
Yes, that's a very good question. And I think lots of FIs and banks are struggling to find the right answer, but they're continuously trying to do that. I think it is about striking the right balance between the effectiveness and efficiency. So when we talk about effectiveness, so that's probably the first principle. We must ensure as a financial institution that we are identifying individuals, entities, jurisdictions subject to sanctions. So we must ensure that we are not missing something during our screening. So false negatives, we don't want that. So the effectiveness is achieved in that way. If you identify every single individual entity or sanctions target, then you have done your job well. But that's in theory. In practice, it means if you adopt that approach, it means that there is a trade-off with the efficiency. So you need probably to sacrifice a little bit of your effectiveness in order to gain on the efficiencies, to reduce the false positive. And how we can do that? So I think the key is the data. The data is very important to have good quality data on your screening list. So even if you have third-party provider, to satisfy yourself as a financial institution that the list that they provide to you, the data there is at the level that you would expect. Otherwise, you will end up with a large number of false positives. At the same time, it is your own data on your customer database. You need to ensure that it is up to date. So it goes then to the KYC refresh. So have you done that? Even if you have done that, if you are an institution which is in the market for a longer time, before 1994, for example, you'll probably have a lot of your data not be subject to the money laundering directives, and therefore probably you'll need to do something about that remediation. The new trends, they're not new, but for some traditional banks are probably new. Machine learning, AI, this is something that can significantly help. And I think it is the human factor as well. Probably more staff involved in working the alerts with good knowledge of sanctions, but also understanding of machine learning and AI solutions and how they can be adjusted to the specific model of that particular financial institution.
Okay, that's great. Shabir, what would you say about false positives? And then zooming out a little bit and coming back to the bigger picture, what best practice approaches can firms take to improve the efficiency and effectiveness and indeed the compliance of sanctions screening on a wider basis?
Sure. And I think the responses we got in terms of challenges faced by financial institutions towards sanctions compliance kind of goes back to what I'm going to mention about. Overall, I think a strong and effective sanction systems governance framework with well-defined systems policy, along with associated procedures, well-configured system, ongoing system tuning with an industry-leading solution is essential for improving the efficiency, effectiveness, and compliance of any financial institution sanctions compliance program, sanctions screening program. I think it certainly doesn't hurt to have this framework validated by our model validators, by auditors, by external regulators on an ongoing basis, so that there is some certainty to, and there's some there is some credible challenge to what you have done so far, which has been validated by multiple bodies who are knowledgeable in the subject matter. Also one more thing which we as a bank do on a frequent basis is performance testing. So how are we against X number of our industry peers? Much of this, what we do is a risk-based approach. So looking at it from an absolute basis might not be perhaps the best way to going about doing certain things in terms of configuration and tuning. Looking at a widespread industry benchmark might be a good idea in terms of where you want to set your thresholds, how you want to tune your system on an ongoing basis. And this has become even more useful in current times with the Russia-Ukraine situation, where most financial institutions are struggling to lower their false positive alert rate, yet being compliant with all list updates. So I think if there is a strong and effective sanction system governance framework, which defines what data you'll be sourcing from where, what references data will be used, what fields will be used for screening purpose, that kind of makes a grander approach to no matter what the wave in recent times, but you are well positioned to weather any storm.
Okay, Jan, coming over to you on this one, how can you help people with the overall picture, the efficiency, the effectiveness, the compliance? There's a lot to do.
Yeah, definitely. What was said, I couldn't agree more with that. Basically, the key is the data, to be able to process it efficiently, fast, and the new approaches like machine learning seem to be helping quite a lot, and definitely there seems to be quite a lot of potential for the future as well. And in general, I would say that the automation is the key here. As we discussed at the beginning, we can very likely expect that this sanctions instrument is going to be used more and more, and probably in more targeted ways. And with that, basically the manual approach will not scale well. So the automation is the key. And with that, we can definitely think about sanctions screening tools that help us actually collect or have the consolidated sets of sanctions lists, for example. But again, as I mentioned at the beginning, it actually follows internally on our data management practices and data governance practices to be able to actually not just do the right thing with the data that we have, but also make sure that the data that we provide to these sanction screening tools are the right data, are the complete data. If we miss, for example, a branch or a recently acquired company, that could be a huge miss in terms of the sanctions. So definitely being able to have a clear visibility into our data environment, being able to identify what we actually do with the data before we pass it to the sanction screening tools is, I believe, the key that will play a huge role in the future. And that's not just for the sanctions screening, but in general, it applies to anti-money laundering, FCC compliance, and others that basically very much use similar sets of data, or at least subsets of those.
Okay, thank you. Coming over to you, Oliver, we've mentioned some of the technologies. Could you bring that together for us and tell us what's really useful here? It's a big fish to manage.
Yeah, I think, I think technology, tools, etc. This is something that is we have seen a lot of progress, since the last 10 years. Before, I mean, these sanction screening tools, etc., they were often bespoke a solution, in-house coded, based on open source libraries, and and then there were Liebenstein algorithms implemented that you could use for name matching, etc. I think the point is still, I mean, you can either code this on your own if you're an institution, or you can rely on a software company and buy something, right? The same is then for the data, right? I mean, you can either source the data yourself, because these sanction lists are available on the regulators' websites. You probably might want to comply with multiple regulators, so you need to have some approach to normalize this data and download this from multiple regulator websites. So there, of course, I mean, their technology can help you, right? I mean, but I think it is very important that you have a underlying concept, right? And when we developed our service, we created something that we call the sanction matrix, right? So this means that we try to normalize in a matrix. So we load in all regulators into a database, and then we try to normalize the programs, like if you want on a horizontal level, that we can then compare between a UK view, a European view, and for instance, a US view. So the example there, China sanctions then would only be something that would appear in a US view, right? because if you have such a normalization, then you can apply this to your compliance policy, right? Because it's depending then also with which, I mean, the decision that you need to take, with which regulator do you want to comply, right? I mean, if you have no US exposure, if you have no US clients, so the question is, do you want to comply with US sanctions, or do you have in case you have US client base, then you probably want to do this. What is your risk appetite? Like I said before, for instance, if there is grandfathered securities or stuff that has been issued prior to the sanctions, you still can trade it, but probably you want to know because you're afraid that there might be something changes. So I think you need some point a approach that is a date that has that you need to get your data right, you need to get the software right, but I think on top of it there, it's more important that you have a compliance framework. And there, I think we're going to talk later about this. There is a document out there on the OFAC website available, the OFAC compliance commitments. And I think this is something that you put together a program that you know what you want to do, and then use the technology and data to support this. These are the big challenges.
Okay, thank you. Jan, you mentioned technology previously. How do you approach this in terms of the technology, and where does the ML and AI come in?
Well, I guess there are two main approaches. One is about the data pipeline that we follow conceptually, where the data may be coming from, if we are sourcing all the aspects of it, for example, in the KYC type of concept. And the second one is the ML approach, especially when we are talking about the particle data records, where we may want to use it to do better comparisons of, I don't know, for example, name matching algorithms or approximate fuzzy matching of the entities and so on. And for that, I would say that a lot of can actually be reused from the past, because we have had for years MDM solutions where this fuzzy matching is applied, for example, in a very similar way. So I believe that a lot of these concepts are well known, but applied to the particle aspects, like sanction lists based on person, or based on the names or organizations or things like that. The thing that is now being done. A lot of the challenge is coming from tracing the graphs of the dependencies.
Okay, you're breaking up a bit there, Jan. So next, on your next question, let's just check we can hear you well. But I'll move on for now, and I'm going to come back to Shabir, please. That all-important question: what are the skills needed to sustain and implement, or really to implement and sustain successful sanctions screening? And how can these skills be sourced? Obviously, we're really suffering in our industry from skills shortage, sanctions numbers, complexities going up. How do you approach that?
So for our bank, we have embarked in this past 4 or 5 years on a journey of simplification and modernization of our screening systems. We have reduced from 5 screening systems to 2. So that goes into simplification of our sanction screening landscape. And then we have leveraged vendor-provided rules-based machine learning capabilities. And now we are on a journey to leverage data-driven machine learning capabilities to reduce our false positives. And in doing so, we have required data scientists, system engineers, data engineers, and these skills have been much sought after even earlier. With the current crisis, the resource crunch in the market, it's been even more difficult. And some of this knowledge is very system specific if you're talking about a specific screening system. It is difficult to source them, not only because they're rare and few, but most of them are already employed by your competitors who have a similar solution implemented. So certainly they come at a premium, and most of our sourcing, we do it through through referrals, employee referrals, word of mouth, people we have worked with in the past and know and can vouch for their skills and expertise. So that's how we source majority of our team members. Many of our team members have worked with the bank for a long period of time, and they were in different functions, have expressed interest in moving into data science related functions, and that's how they have been sourced. And then we have, they've gone through the cadence of significant amount of learning and training, and they have come thus far. So that's really, I believe, data science skills, data engineering skills, system specific skills based on the solutions we have implemented is certainly needed, and has and always be in short supply. And continuous training for the people we have on team is critical towards having a successful sanction screening program.
Thank you very much indeed. And again, coming to you, Igor, as another practitioner, what skills do you need and how hard are they to get them? Is it an internal training job, or should be a bit of a mix?
Yes, it's good question. Everyone involved in recruitment in this area, they will know it's not an easy task to find the right blend of skills required for this type of role. So could be as a great believer in developing the talent that we have in the bank. I think one option is to train staff that you already have in the bank. But for screening, from screening perspective, I think it is you need someone with the right blend of what Shabir mentioned: data management, coding, but also good understanding of the sanctions. It is not just comparing data set to data set. It is important to know why we do that. So that's very important. And training, continuous training, because things are moving very quickly. Understanding of the sanctions regimes and understanding how the data can be used, and in order to help machine learning were mentioned as well. But so at higher level, just very briefly, I would just say that it is not just sanction screening specific challenge. I think it is challenge within the whole that framework of sanctions compliance. Oliver mentioned about the OFAC guidance. How do we comply? So screening is one of the tools that we use to comply, but it is important to have the senior management involvement, right policies and procedures in place, testing and auditing, very important, and the training is probably becoming even more important, though quite often pushed down on the priority list by many FIs dealing with more important things, which I don't think it is always the right approach.
Okay, thank you both very much indeed. And we have a number of audience questions, so let me see what people are wanting to know. And I'm going to come back to you, Igor, because you mentioned this earlier, and it says, what does the panel think about outsourcing sanctions screening?
So,
sorry, carry on.
So do you need to answer on outsourcing, or what I think, or?
Yeah. What is it? Is it a good thing? Is it possible?
It is possible, but it is, even if the FI decides to outsource, the responsibility for compliance with the sanctions still remains with the FI. So that is very important. So if you decide to outsource, for example, you need to ensure that you have a strong, robust process within the FI for that outsourcing to be covered. So all testing to be carried out. So in short, the FI will need to satisfy themselves that the company that they are outsourcing to have the skill set, and that they will actually benefit from outsourcing rather than developing in-house solution. That's one thing. And the second thing is, when it comes to outsourcing, an important element is the GDPR requirements. So, or Data Protection Act in the UK. So there could be some hurdles from that perspective, even if you decide to do something. So you need to be absolutely clear who is the data owner, data controller, data processor. And as I mentioned before, if you outsource, you are the data controller. And the party that is doing the screening for you, they are the data processors, but the data controller is still responsible for the data processor. So that's the key.
Right.
And Sarah, if I can comment here,
Please.
mostly what I've observed is that some parts of your alert review process is outsourced. Typically, your level 1 low quality alerts, which typically is the large volume of your overall alerts, is outsourced to a third party for them to review based on predefined rules and protocols and escalate as and when needed. But the entire sanction screening process for a financial institution being outsourced is very rare. I have not seen it in the 20 years of my experience, but that is a possibility. But like Igor mentioned, the responsibility of that still lies with the financial institution.
Okay, thank you. Indeed, it's a large responsibility and one not easily given away, obviously. Okay, fine. I have another question here, and Oliver, perhaps you'd like to address this one. It asks, would panelists agree that having unique identifiers added in the sanctions list, perhaps the LEI, for sanctioned entities, would reduce challenges and complexity with regards to sanctions processing?
I mean, of course, the LEI being an open standard, this would be very good. I mean, we have seen it in the poll before. I mean, identifying these entities is very hard, right? And when it comes to other languages or like OFAC, like we had it with the first CMIC sanctions under Trump, speaking of close name matches, so there the whole industry was confused. I mean, what would be a close name match? This is something, and we know the 50% rule, right? We know the OFAC FAQs 401 with the examples, but a close name match, nobody knew that. I mean, luckily this has been reverted back by President Biden, but I mean, this would be good. The same thing is for instance now also for these for the sanctions that have an impact on securities, right? We have seen, I mean, the first time. I mean, I think in Venezuela, in the Venezuela case, there are some, security identification number, ISIN numbers were given out by OFAC. In the CMIC case, there were also, I think, 600 ISINs that were listed by OFAC. And now in the Russia case, we haven't seen this anymore because probably, OFAC didn't have the data. So I think there is we were present at a conference 2 weeks ago directly in DC where some OFAC representatives were present, and these were also issues that were directly addressed to OFAC. Probably they got the point, right? Probably they also should invest into getting the data better, right? I mean, probably this is also the point, right? OFAC is not giving us all the data. It's probably because they don't have more data to give.
Okay, fine. Yeah, and coming to you with my next question here from our audience. It says, how would the panel suggest we clean up problems like spelling mistakes and typos in our internal and externally sourced data? This is quite a beginning of the journey kind of thing. How should firms be doing that?
That's an excellent question for sure. I mean, this goes back to the overall data quality and data management in the organization. And again, it does not apply to sanctions only, even though for sanctions we have a clear need why and how to fix it. But overall, this is the whole data management process for anti-money laundering, for other activities, and even just for marketing or cost of marketing internally, right? So definitely, from my perspective, it would be a sort of standard data quality process and basically prioritizing these requirements with these sanctions in mind to give them higher priority and basically sort of calculate return on investment or cost of the risk that we're taking if we don't fix them. But at the same time, we see that some organizations basically use these typos and concatenated names, things like that, as a way to avoid the sanctions, hoping that basically organizations do not catch these or do not catch them at least reliably, to basically sort of sneak in, find a way through the sanctions. So definitely, it's a quite challenging topic, and I'm not sure if others have anything to add, for example, to it.
Sure. Jan, I think there are expectations on two sides. One is the reference list we get from our reference list providers. We could source it directly from the regulatory agency's website, as someone mentioned. This is all publicly published. But the reason we decide to choose from a references provider is so that they can take care of the data quality issues as the names are getting published on these government websites. So that we are expecting, as per the ISA 3000 standards, they have data quality checks and controls in place before they provide us these reference list updates. On the other side, we are expecting that our IT team has the right data governance and controls in place so that data, transaction data, or party data, as it's sourced for sanction screening, it is of appropriate quality and held to a certain standard. So on both sides, there needs to be governance in place so that we, being in sanction screening, are assured of the results coming out of our sanction screening implementations.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I just add, sorry,
Yeah, sure.
very briefly, all well covered. Just one thing from FI perspective, we are also expected to have fuzzy logic when we screen. So that will mitigate the risk to a certain extent, so misspelling and transpositions and different translations of names. So that's another challenge for the banks, because it comes to the question where you set your thresholds in respect to the fuzzy logic screening, but it is helpful to mitigate that risk.
Okay, thank you all. And I have one more that I'm going to put to you, Shabir, as a practitioner. It says, we need to improve our sanctions screening processes. It's a large task and we have limited resources. Where should we start?
So I guess yes, it is not something you can undertake in a day. For our bank, 4 or 5 years ago, we were not as big as what we are today. We have grown at least 2, if not 3-fold in the past 4 years. And as a result, we are held to newer standards, and our compliance department as a result has grown as well. So I guess prioritization at the C-suite level in terms of allocating more resources towards building your compliance function. Knowledgeable people in functional area, in data area, and technology area, having the right tools in place. And if you don't have that, having a plan for replacement of your existing tools with industry leading tools, leveraging latest technology, implementing machine learning, robotic process automation to automate some of your repetitive tasks, outsourcing the work which can be done by a different group or team or company, and better utilize your resources, focusing with where the true risk price, right, with the level 2, level 3 hits. So I guess all in all, if all of these things were taken into consideration over time, you will achieve your compliance goals.
Okay, but if you're just starting out, you need to get the right people in the right place with the right support and look at the danger. Yes, and underpinning all of this is executive buy-in. The tone at the top, it's extremely important, having the CEO's buy-in, the C-level suites buy-in towards allocating resources towards the compliance function. Setting the tone of compliance at the very top is crucial towards driving transformative change in the compliance organization.
There I would really say, have a read at this OFAC compliance commitments document. You find this online, right? OFAC talks about the culture of compliance, right? All these steps are there, it needs to come from the management, there needs to be this culture of compliance. You need to establish a risk assessment, with whom you want to comply. You need to set up internal controls, calibration of your KYC tools, not only to reduce false positives, but also not to miss positives, right? And then you need to establish a training, and this needs to come top down. You can't simply purchase a KYC screening system and then think that you have implemented your compliance program. This wouldn't be sufficient.
Yeah, and just one more thing, Sarah, if I can mention. So I mentioned earlier about having effective controls. An example of these set of controls is, data completeness testing on an ongoing basis, list completeness testing on an ongoing basis, making sure that whatever is being published by the regulatory agency is actually coming through in your references feed, making sure that whatever data you are supposed to screen in terms of transactions, in terms of names, is actually coming through. So doing this testing, also doing performance testing, running a set of test names in your screening system, exact and fuzzy, making sure that a match is being obtained for such names, that ensures the health of your system and make sure the tuning you've done is just right for your risk appetite. Okay, that's great. And coming to you, Jan, these are things we've talked about.
can you just take us through the practical steps that we've just been sort of talking about, a bit mixed? So what practical steps would you talk to about a customer implementing sanctions screening?
Yeah, so to summarize what's been said, definitely first have the definition or define and accepted the risk appetite from the top management, because as Shabir mentioned, what you're doing in sanctions is in 90% cases risk driven. You very likely cannot be like 100% compliant. So definitely have the compliance level set. Then have the right people, right tools in place, and that includes both internal sources as well as the external sources for the data and the people. Outsource what can be outsourced, keep in house what you have, for example, a business knowledge about that cannot easily be transferred or outsourced, right? And then from my perspective, definitely automation is the key to automate what you can. And some of these activities, when we're talking about the data quality, about expectations from IT, it actually turns out that they are not just for sanctions, right? They apply overall throughout the company. So again, basically get the buy-in from other departments to get the management interest in those, and basically do the data quality properly, because it will help the other departments as well. It's not only the compliance department who will benefit from it. So from my perspective, we also get the buy-in from other departments to basically join the efforts and benefit from larger investments altogether.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to move on, and we're going to squeeze in a final audience poll. The question this time: beyond compliance, what extent of business and operational benefits does your organization gain or expect to gain from an effective sanctions screening solution? Kind of tying up with some of the things Jan was just saying about it being more than just sort of a one department effort. So whilst you vote, let me come to, if I may, to Oliver to talk a little bit about this. Where do you see the benefits beyond compliance?
Yeah, so I think really, it comes down to have a clear view on your exposure, right? So the point is, to some point, I mean, what we have seen, many clients have well-established KYC, AML systems in place. They can screen their client base. They can screen their customer base. They're screening transactions. But on the other point, then when it, for instance, comes to security screening, which now comes more and more in scope, they don't have anything in place, right? So what we see now, and then since we are a vendor that is, for instance, providing securities that are tainted, by this 50% rule, so you will find an oligarch on the sanction list, but the company that he owns, you won't find on the sanction list, and the security you won't find either on that sanction list, or like some special purpose financing vehicles you won't find either, right? So you can try to build this on your own, right? Just based on the data sets that you have, or you can reach out to a client, right? Or to a vendor, right? What we just have seen, that since it's becoming more and more complex, a financial institution, they need, I mean, you're past that point that you can have, that you can code these solutions on your own. So there's many vendors out there. There is software vendors out there. There's data vendors out there. And probably if you speak to these vendors, in the end of the day, you will see that working together closely with the vendor, it might be even cheaper for the company in the long run, because otherwise you will have to hire that staff and that constantly updates these lists, that constantly updates the software. Just also when we're just talking regular system updates that you need to do. So I think to some part you can outsource this to software vendors and to data vendors, but again, this is hard to say. It depends probably also of the size of the institution.
Okay, Shabir, what would you say in terms of added value beyond compliance, if there is any?
Yeah, I think it allows the financial institutions to scale effectively. If you have compliance done right, you are allowed to, by the local regulatory body where you operate, allowed to grow in variety and volume. Sometimes you are held in terms of your growth because you don't have an effective sanctions compliance program in place. So making sure that you have sanctions done right helps you with scalability. It helps you with fewer lookbacks to identify risks. It helps you with reduced voluntary disclosures to regulatory bodies, lesser possibility of a downstream financial institution identifying an issue with a payment, so on and so forth. So I think uh, perhaps not getting this right could indicate systemic challenges in detection, and that could open up your Pandora's box of troubles, if you will. It also is reflective of a poor system governance environment, which is really what regulators are looking for. They're looking for systemic issues which which need to be solved on a more grand basis, and that could land you into regulatory hot water.
Okay, fine. I'm going to come to our last question now, as we are coming close to the end of our time today. And let me come first to you, Igor, if I may. What guidance would you give to practitioners who are working on sanctions screening?
Yes, so conscious of the time, I will keep this very short. I think that if I need to select three key things, I would probably say understanding of the risk that we manage with the sanction screening. So it is not just simple comparing one set of data to another. And that coupled with good knowledge of the staff working on the sanction screening, good technical knowledge. So what we mentioned before, understanding of data management, coding, and so on. The second one is have your data sorted, both the external data feeding into screening system and your customer data. And the third thing is strike the right balance between the efficacy and efficiency.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Shabir, what would you say here?
I think doing ongoing performance testing of your systems, multiple control activities, including list and data validation, configuring your system effectively based on your risk appetite, and doing ongoing tuning as and when needed. And most importantly, having the right mix of skills on your team, people with functional knowledge, people with data understanding, people with technology understanding is the key.
Thank you very much. And Oliver, a few words from you.
I would also say, I mean, at first, I mean, to some point, do this assessment, right? Have a look, how is your geographical footprint, in which countries you're active, what is your client base, right? What is your exposure? What is your investment exposure, right? And then that you can make this decision, then we probably will have to look into, make that then do this assessment we are invested in, and then you can take a decision, a risk-based approach, and this is how you can then define how much risk you're going to take and which regulators you're going to follow, what are you going to wind down, etc., etc.
Okay, and yeah, and some final words from you.
No, I definitely agree with everything that's been said. To add to it, I would say look at the broader picture. I believe that this expansion of the sanction screening is a good opportunity for internal transformation of the organization, and there's a lot that can be achieved with these things that we need to do for sanctions overall. So definitely cross-organizational commitments and so also gain benefits.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all very much indeed. And thank you for sharing your expertise and experience with us. Thank you too to Manta and Six for sponsoring today's webinar. Before we close up, just a few 18 group items that may be of interest to you. If you scroll down your screen, you can see the additional options. You can register for our next data management webinars covering best practices for building high-performance data infrastructures, enabling data democratization with trusted and well-governed data, and data standards and global identifiers. So that's it for today. So thank you again to Oliver, Igor, and Shabir, and thank you to all of you who've taken part in the webinar. Sorry I ran out of time to show that last poll result. I hope it was a positive one for you all. Anyway, meantime, do please complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Thanks again, and goodbye.